Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the virtual Red Bench. I am Abby. If you haven't met me yet, I am the director at the Vermont Ski and Snowboard Museum. Welcome to April. We've made it this far. We've been doing this virtual series every month since August. I hope those of you that have joined us along the way have been enjoying these discussions. I want to remind you that this series is complimentary. However, the donations from these events provide important funding for us and, of course, help us continue to bring you these discussions. If you found value in what we're doing, we hope you'll make a donation tonight, and thank you to those of you that already have. We may be winding down the Red Bench season, but we still have socks to give away. Darn Tough has been super generous supplying us with socks to raffle off at every event. Your donation is your raffle ticket. $10 gets you one entry, and you get additional entries in increments of $10. Normally I would draw the winners tomorrow, but I'm going to draw them on Monday to give you plenty of time to make those donations. And I will put the link in the chat a little bit later. If you have already donated, you've already been entered. And don't forget about our membership program. Membership starts at $60 for the year and comes with a slew of benefits, including our member benefit book with approximately $1,000 in savings. Memberships at the $100 level or higher also receive free admission to over 1,000 museums across the country. Discount and admission information can be found on our website, as well as all the additional benefits. And I really hope you consider joining the museum family. All right, celebrating winter is something that we take very seriously here at the museum. In fact, you might say it's at the foundation of who we are. It makes perfect sense that we would gather around the Red Bench with John Morton to talk about his recent book, Celebrate Winter, and Olympian Stories of a Life in Nordic Skiing. I received a copy of this book shortly after it was published. I've always had an appreciation of Nordic skiing, but it wasn't until this year that I really dedicated my time to learning. As a lifelong alpine skier, I especially love the book's dedication. You will find inspiration on every page of this book, but I didn't have to get too far to find what I needed to take on a new sport. John will talk about his collection of stories in this book, but I encourage everyone to add this book to their library. We do have signed copies available in our gift shop and our online store. I also want to thank our Red Bench series sponsors, Sisler Builders and Vermont Ski and Ride. We'll answer questions at the end, so if you have any, please type them into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can towards the end. And let me introduce you to our guest of honor this evening. John Morton has attended 10 Winter Olympic Games in various roles: athlete, coach, team leader, chief of course, and U.S. Biathlon team fan. John is the author of 3 books about Nordic skiing: Don't Look Back, A Medal of Honor, and his most recent book, Celebrate Winter. In 1990, John founded and continues to operate what has become a premier competition and recreational trail design company, Morton Trails. He has completed more than 230 projects across the United States and abroad. Thank you for joining us tonight, John. I will let you take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Abby. It's a real treat for me to be here this evening, and I really admire and appreciate what you do for the sport of skiing at the Vermont Ski and Snowboard Museum. I think I'll start out by just giving a quick little background of how I sort of stumbled into skiing in the first place. I grew up in southwestern New Hampshire. The town that I grew up in had basically 2 sports in the high school, basketball and baseball, and I was pathetic at both of those through junior high. I was offered a partial scholarship to go to a boarding school in central New Hampshire, and the only reason I was really interested in going was because they had a ski team, and by that time I had somehow discovered skiing and enjoyed it very much. That gave me the opportunity to go to Middlebury College, where I skied on the Middlebury ski team. And Middlebury at the time had compulsory reserve officer training corps for the first 2 years for all the male students. And it was during the Vietnam War, and many of us figured we were going to end up going one way or another. So it seemed a smart choice to stay in our ROTC. I thought I had a little edge in that I had heard about this little small unit in Alaska that was operated by the Army to train athletes for the sport of biathlon, which until that point, I had never even heard of. I didn't even know what it was, but it's a combination of cross-country skiing and rifle marksmanship, which even at that time was very popular in Europe, although virtually unknown here in the States. Anyway, I had a 4-year obligation in the military, 3 of which I was able to spend in Alaska, training and competing in biathlon. And then I got out and taught school and coached in Anchorage for 4 years before I was offered the position of head coach of men's skiing at Dartmouth. And so I relocated from Alaska back to Thetford, Vermont, which is only a 20-minute commute to Hanover, New Hampshire, and coached the Dartmouth ski team for 11 years, which was a wonderful opportunity to work with some of the most motivated and gifted young people in the sport. And then because many of those athletes were able to go on to the national team, both in cross-country skiing and in biathlon, I was offered the opportunity to have various volunteer positions through the years at different major events, World Cup events, World Championships, World University Games, and several Olympic Games. So it was not too long ago that I realized that, boy, I had a very unusual perspective on the sport of skiing as a competitor, then a coach, and then as in more of the administrative positions. And for a while, I can't remember exactly how many years, but probably 12 to 15 years, I was one of several commentators for Vermont Public Radio with a loose assignment to cover offbeat sports. In other words, they weren't particularly interested in something to do with baseball or basketball or football, but they loved commentaries on canoeing or hiking or cycling or sports like biathlon and cross country. And then there was a sports newspaper in Vermont called Vermont Sports Today, and I ended up doing a monthly column for them for a while. So this book, Celebrate Winter, is a collection of many of those articles and stories from both of those, either VPR or Vermont Sports Today, and that deal with skiing. So I think I'll start out by reading one that is from my days as a competitor. And this is titled Victory in the Sauna. In 1970, the Biathlon World Championships were held in Östersund, Sweden. Sven Johansson, the legendary coach of the U.S. Biathlon Training Center in Alaska, was proud to lead a group of young American athletes back to his homeland. The Swedes rival the Finns in their national passion for the sauna. As the championships drew near, Sven took us to the village of Umeå for a final training race. The competition was hosted by a local club, and following the awards ceremony, we were invited to their sports center for a sauna. This was not the warm room and swimming pool type of sauna that Americans find at the local Holiday Inn. This was the authentic variety, a small cedar-lined room heated to well over 100 degrees centigrade, that's 212 Fahrenheit, and a dipping pool that was literally floating with ice on the surface. At one point, 4 Americans, including Sven, occupied the uppermost and therefore hottest bench. As we hunkered down near the ceiling, hanging our heads in the intense heat, 3 young Swedes entered the sauna. They recognized us as Americans and with some reluctance sat on the bench below us. It was embarrassing for them, masters of this form of bathing, to be seated on the lower, cooler level, while the visiting Americans, bumbling amateurs at the art of the sauna, quietly endured the intense heat inches from the ceiling. We had been ready to leave when the young Swedes entered, but national pride demanded that we wait a reasonable interval before exiting to the ice water pool. We suffered in silence, none of us wanting to be the first to give in. The Swedes broke the spell by mumbling among themselves. On the top bench, Sven listened, his muscles tensed. The Swedish racers had not recognized Sven and had no way of knowing that he understood their every word. In English, he casually whispered to us, "They going try to force us out, boys. Don't nobody move till I tell you." The Swede closest to the door reached for the water bucket and casually ladled a couple of pints onto the red-hot rocks. The droplets danced for an instant before they billowed toward the ceiling in a cloud of steam. The vapor caught me as I began to inhale, and I stopped mid-breath. The scalding air curled the hair in my nostrils. My arms and back prickled. We were being poached alive. But nobody moved. Slowly, the steam subsided. As the cloud dissolved, it revealed the same Swede ladling more water on the rocks. The steam billowed, and I braced myself for another onslaught. About half the bucket of water remained when the young Swede, for a third time, reached for the ladle. Sven sprang to the floor like a cat. He grabbed the bucket from the Swede, and turning toward the stove, he shouted, "Damn it, boys, don't tease us. If you're going to heat this place up, then heat it up good." And he emptied the bucket on the stove. Never have I seen three men move so quickly. The instant before the scalding vapor engulfed us, it was just elbows and buttocks clamoring for the exit. As the door slammed behind the Swedes, Sven ordered us to hit the deck. 4 Americans dove for the floor, faces pressed to the cedar slats, gasping for breath. Miraculously, we survived. The cloud began to dissipate, and Sven hauled us back up to the top bench. With heads spinning and nostrils burning, we acted disinterested when wide-eyed faces peered through the glass in the door. After a polite interval, we climbed down on jellied legs and tottered from the hot room. The 3 young bucks stood naked in the locker room, gaping at us. Normally, the icy plunge is a challenge, even after the hottest sauna. But this time it was heaven. We paddled around, bobbed below the surface, and chatted lightheartedly. When we finally made our way back to the locker room, every eye in the place followed us. We must have been quite a sight, wrinkled red skin hanging on exhausted, trembling frames. Yet there is a certain pleasure to beating someone at their own game. And I will confess that story is not exaggerated at all. And there are still some other survivors from that trip that will support me on this. That's just about the way it happened, and it was a beautiful experience. And we went from that town of Umeå, which is up very near the Arctic Circle in Sweden, back down to Östersund. But I remember that competition in Östersund. There were days where we were training for the races, in between races, and it was well below zero. I think Fahrenheit, and we were like, there were some days where it was 20 below, bitterly cold. So that was a story basically from my days as a competitor. I picked one now from my days coaching at Dartmouth, and this one's called The Joys of Roller Skiing. After 11 years as head coach of men's skiing at Dartmouth College, there are only a couple of incidents that I'd rather forget. Ironically, the most vivid doesn't even involve snow. Roller skiing is the most specific form of off-season training for cross-country. Equipped with ski poles and stubby wheeled slats similar to inline skates, Nordic racers kick and glide or skate the back roads of New England throughout the summer and fall. One of the many traditions I inherited when I began coaching at Dartmouth was a 50-kilometer roller ski time trial the Sunday before Thanksgiving. The event started on the Norwich Town Green and climbed through the hills to Union Village, on to Thetford, and finally back to Norwich. It was a grueling 3-hour endurance test, including several steep descents, 2 with sharp turns into classic covered bridges. I had severe misgivings about the safety of the route, especially for the younger skiers who lacked the experience on roller skis. But the time trial was a well-established tradition of the ski team, a rite of passage for the freshmen, and I hesitated to question any sacred Dartmouth traditions in my rookie year as coach. After starting the athletes at 1-minute intervals, I drove the van along the route, providing water stations and encouragement. By the time I reached the common on Thetford Hill, there was a 30-minute spread between the faster and slower skiers. When I approached the steep curve above the Union Village covered bridge, I thought I had overtaken everyone, but I couldn't be sure. As I climbed out of the van, my heart stopped. There was a ghastly smear of congealed blood across the road. I stared at the slippery red stain in horror, visualizing one of my skiers plowing into the hood of an oncoming car, the panicked driver throwing the broken body into the vehicle for a frantic rush to the hospital. At that instant, one of my athletes thundered around the corner. He was crouched low, his legs spread, his skis vibrating wildly on the rough pavement. Sparks flew from his pole tips as he dragged them in a futile effort to slow down. His eyes widened in terror as he approached the steep, twisting descent to the quaint covered bridge. I sprinted full speed behind the skier and grabbed the waistband of his pants. As I slowed to a jog and then a walk, the color returned to his face. From a standing start 100 yards above the bridge, the turn was negotiable. I released my grip and watched the athlete roll smoothly into the opening of the bridge. Then, sickened by the smear of blood on the road, I sprinted back up the hill to intercept the next skier. One by one, the athletes roared into sight. I raced to catch them, slowed them to a stop, then bolted back up the hill. Joe Cook, a local character whose house guards the entrance to the bridge, found this so entertaining that he pulled a lawn chair to the edge of his porch and sat down to enjoy the show. As I sprinted up and down the hill, Joe watched with the detached amusement of a world-class figure skating judge. When I was pretty sure all my skiers had passed the bloody corner, I hopped in the van and pulled onto the pavement. But in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of David Willauer, a freshman who had never roller skied before arriving at Dartmouth earlier that fall. He was hunched down in a bow-legged crouch and so petrified that he made not the slightest effort to reduce his speed. I slammed the van into park as David shot past. I scrambled from the seat, lunged and grabbed in one desperate motion. I felt the elastic waistband and yanked him to a stop like the arresting cable on an aircraft carrier. He was shaking uncontrollably and couldn't talk. Trying to sound calm, I said, "Take your skis and poles off. I'll go get the van. You've had enough training for today." As I hiked up the hill for the last time, Joe Cook stood and began to applaud. "Son of a gun, that was great. You fellas gonna do this every Sunday morning?" "No way," I answered. "This is the last time, as long as I'm the coach." As a dreaded afterthought, I asked, "Was there an accident here earlier?" "What?" Joe seemed bewildered. "All that blood on the road. Did one of my guys get hit?" Joe's face resolved into a broad smile. "Oh, that? Hell no. One of the Barker boys got himself a nice little buck about sunrise, had to drag it up the bank and across the road to his pickup. That's deer blood you see there." And that's another true story. No exaggeration on that one at all. So then I went from coaching to more of these sort of administrative positions. I was a team leader for a number of biathlon trips, either to world championships, World Cups, won World University Games in Poland, and a number of Olympics. And people often ask, well, what's a team leader do? And the best way to explain it is the team leader tries to do everything that allows the coaches to coach and the athletes to concentrate on doing their best in the events. So it involves a wide range of probably problem solving and efforts to minimize the stress and distractions for the athletes and the coaches. But there's a significant, there aren't a lot of long restful nights for a team leader at the Olympic Games. There's always something to worry about and try to anticipate. This story comes from the Calgary Games in 1988, and it was my first time as team leader, and there had already been a couple of incidents prior to this one I'm going to describe, so I was already pretty well stressed out, and then this one came along. This one is called Dipping the Flag. I've been a member of 6 Winter Olympic teams. As a team leader for the U.S. biathletes, my responsibilities were pretty mundane. I attended meetings, disseminated information to the coaches, ensured that our competitors were properly entered in their events, and occasionally ran interference for the athletes with the media. But due to the worldwide fascination with the Olympics, every team leader endures the actual 16 days of the games, trying to suppress a constant sense of panic. At the 1972 Summer Games in Munich, 2 American sprinters, both potential medal winners, watched their qualifying heats on television, unaware of a last-minute schedule change. Their team leader has lived with the guilt of that oversight ever since. There are dozens of similar horror stories. One of my worst nightmares as a biathlon team leader occurred at the Calgary Olympics in 1988. Lyle Nelson had been selected by his teammates to be the flag bearer, to lead the entire US delegation into the opening ceremony. While the entire world watched, it was a tremendous honor, and Lyle was a worthy choice. For many years, he had been the top US biathlete. He was a West Point graduate, and Calgary marked his 4th Winter Olympics as a competitor. Lyle's selection as the flag bearer also provided an intense focus of media attention on the biathlon team. For an obscure sport, this was a public relations goldmine. Finally, the afternoon of the opening ceremony arrived, blown in by a bitter Arctic wind roaring across the Alberta plains. As the Parade of Nations was about to begin, Lyle, carrying the impressive stars and stripes, cornered me in the back of the US delegation. "Hey, Morty," he said brightly, "I've been thinking about dipping the flag." According to Olympic tradition, the flag bearers of each nation dip their flags to the dignitaries of the host country in a gesture of respect and goodwill. But in the 1936 Winter Olympics in Garmisch, Germany, the American athletes decided to snub Hitler by refusing to dip the stars and stripes as the US team marched past his reviewing stand. The snub was repeated in Berlin the following summer and has become an American tradition at every Olympics since. Lyle continued, "The Canadians are our neighbors and strong allies. They have spared no expense to make this the best Winter Olympics ever. Why shouldn't I dip the flag to acknowledge their hard work and their friendship? Isn't that what the Olympic Games are all about?" My mind became a tornado of conflicting thoughts. Philosophically, I agreed with Lyle. The Olympics should be above national politics. But I could also imagine the feeding frenzy that the unauthorized break with tradition might stir up in the media and among some of the crusty old timers on the Olympic Committee. Before the ceremony was over, all the positive exposure biathlon had achieved in the past few days could easily be replaced by hate mail. The parade was about to begin as I responded, "Lyle, I agree with you. I don't see how it diminishes our standing in the eyes of the world if we dip our flag to the Canadians. You were selected to carry the flag, so you follow your conscience. I'll back you up, whatever you decide." Lyle smiled and returned to the front of the delegation as we began marching into the stadium. The roar of the crowd was deafening. My pulse was pounding, mostly from anticipating the international incident I had just sanctioned. As we circled a huge stadium, I strained to watch the flag, but the throng of waving athletes ahead of me made it impossible. It wasn't until we boarded the buses much later that I was able to catch up with Lyle. "Well, did you dip the flag?" I wanted to prepare for the media onslaught that almost certainly would follow. Lyle's face broke into a broad grin. "You know, it was funny. I'd finally made up my mind to do it, but I got so distracted by the excitement, all the cheering, the music, and the TV cameras in my face that I forgot to look for the reviewing stand. By the time I spotted it, we'd already marched past, and it seemed stupid to dip it then." I tried to act nonchalant. As a US citizen, I strongly endorsed the gesture of respect and friendship. But as the team leader who would have been responsible, I'm mighty glad that Lyle got caught up in the celebration. And that's another one, no exaggeration there. So maybe then now would be a good time to open it up for questions, Abby.
I'm muted.
Yeah.
I'm not used to being the moderator on here. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box there. I'll pull them from there. There's one in there now. It's not a question, but Dennis Donahue is in the audience.
Right.
And he said he survived the sauna in Sweden with you, and can attest that the stories that you have told us tonight are all true.
That's true. He was one of the four.
All right. So some other questions. So obviously there's a lot of stories of compiling this book. I guess, what was the process? Did you keep a journal along the way, or notes just to come back and remember these stories? How did you compile all of this?
Yeah, well, as I said at the outset, they actually putting them together in this book was a process of sorting out things that I had already written for either the Vermont commentary, the VPR commentary series, or Vermont Sports Today. There was a while, not long after I finished competing, and then a little bit later when I finished coaching, where I had just a wealth of these stories in my head. And fortunately, then I had the outlet for them with VPR and Vermont Sports Today. So I was able to write many of them down while they were still relatively fresh in my mind. Although I'll have to say that now that we got the book together and printed, I keep thinking of ones that, oh gosh, I forgot that one, and that would have been good. So one of the things that, and this may be true of all sports or activities, but the sport of skiing seems to be really, really rich with these kinds of entertaining stories. Not all specifically about the actual activity of skiing, but the whole culture that surrounds it. There was a early Dartmouth ski coach named Otto Schneebs, and he was famous for saying that skiing is not just a sport, skiing is a way of life. And I think he's correct about that.
Great. There's a question in here. Has the flag ever been dipped since that time?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer of it to that. My assumption is it hasn't been, because I think we would have heard about it. I think somebody would have noticed it or you know, made some kind of an issue out of it. But it's I'm not that I'm aware of.
All right. What year and why did biathlon change to skating?
Well, I don't know the exact year, but biathlon, when Dennis and I were competing, we used large caliber rifles. At the time, the International Federation permitted any caliber up to and including what they call the NATO round, which is 7.62. So it would be like big hunting rifles. And we shot at a range that was 150 meters long. Targets were 150 meters away. There was a move, I think, by the late 1970s, early 1980s, that to reduce the size of the range to 50 meters and go with 22 caliber rifles. And it was largely driven by Central European countries where the population is more condensed, and 150 meter ranges basically take up a lot of space, and there's a noise problem. And so for a number of different reasons, there was this move to go to 22 caliber rifles and shorter ranges. They scaled down the targets so the targets are as difficult to hit now as they were back when we were shooting 150 meters. But at that same time, the skating revolution was coming about, thanks in large part to Bill Koch. And I think that the decision makers in the sport of biathlon decided that the sport was challenging and complicated enough, dealing with, you know, the rifles and ammunition and the whole shooting side of it, so that they decided, well, let's just keep the skiing part of it relatively simple, and we'll go with what at the time was called freestyle. So if you wanted to use classic skis and wax for classic skiing, you were permitted to do that, but it was just slower than skating. So since then, many of the current biathletes do travel with classic skis, though, and they, on their off days for training and just a change of pace, they'll ski classic.
Great. So this question's kind of along the same lines, and you sort of have already answered some of this, but maybe you want to add a little bit more. How has biathlon changed from when you were an athlete?
Yeah, well, in addition to those changes I mentioned, in terms of but going to the skating technique and the 22 caliber rifles, biathlon, I think it would be fair to say that the time when I was competing, when Dennis and there may be others on the Zoom call here that were also competitors at that time, we were sort of the, you know, ugly stepchild of Nordic skiing. You know, nobody, the cross country skiers were the real celebrities, and in Europe, everybody knew who the top cross-country skiers were, but the biathletes were, oftentimes it was thought that, well, the biathletes are the ones that couldn't make the cross-country team. But a couple of decades ago, and I can't tell you the individuals who are responsible for it, but some of the television technicians in Europe developed the ability to show what's happening on the shooting range in a very exciting way. And you'll see the insets. They may have a particular athlete on the screen, but the target will be inset on, and so you can actually see how they're shooting. And they're very good about showing how the shooting changes the positions of the athletes and how dramatically the lead can change. And so that virtually overnight made biathlon what is now the most popular winter sport on European television. And and that has led to a real increase in number of events. When we first started competing, there were two events. There was an individual, which was 20 kilometers long, and a 4 by, I think it was 4 by 7.5K relay. And now, I think the last time I checked at the Pyongyang Olympic Games, I think there were 11 biathlon events. Now, obviously, there were also events for women, which the women started competing. The first Olympics for women was 1992, and there were maybe a couple of world championships before that. But so it's really changed dramatically in terms of the number of events and some of those formats. And when they went to the 22 caliber rifles, they also adopted these metal knockdown targets, so you instantly can see what's a hit and what's a miss. One of the 20 kilometer event that we competed in the old days, we shot on paper, and you never knew until well after the event was over and they scored the targets how you did in the results. So there've been a lot of changes through the years. The other thing I'll say is that today's athletes are remarkably faster, and I would say across the board more skilled than we were. If we came into the range, took the rifle off, got in position, loaded, shot and hit 5 targets, got up and left in under a minute, it was okay. It was acceptable. If you're taking longer than a minute, you're really wasting time. And if you get down by 45 seconds or something, you were doing very well. Today's athletes routinely do that and hit all 5 targets in 25 seconds. It's remarkable how skillful they are. It's wonderful to see, very inspiring for us old guys.
Nice. Were there or are there jumpers competing in all Nordic events who became biathletes in the Olympics?
It is a question of ski jumpers, or?
I would assume so.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. There were, back during the days when, say again, Dennis is on the call here. When we were in college, it was not uncommon for collegiate skiers to compete in all 4 events. At the time, the 4 events were downhill, slalom, jumping, and cross country. And there was an award for the best skier in all those 4 events. It was called the Ski Meister, and there were it was a very coveted award to win a Ski Meister competition at one of the collegiate winter carnivals. That through the years, they eliminated jumping as a collegiate event, And they also eliminated the downhill and replaced it with a giant slalom. And so the Ski Meister event sort of faded. But I would say that from the ranks of college skiers, there were certainly skiers who had jumped that then became biathletes that went into the biathlon training center in Alaska. But I don't know if there were any, I'm not aware of any that were, let's say, special jumpers that may. What brought most of us into biathlon was a military commitment and the knowledge that there was this training center in Alaska. That's how most of us get into it.
All right, veering off from biathlon for a minute here. Are there any Middlebury stories in the book?
Oh yeah. I've got one in there about Patty Sheehan, who is the daughter of the coach during the years that I was there, Bobo Sheehan, and she was a spunky little 11-year-old. And there's one of the first stories in the book is about her coming up to the top of the Middlebury Jump, which sadly isn't there anymore. But it was a big jump. They called it a 50 meter, but it was big. I think they called it a 50 because the NCAA at that time restricted collegiate jumping to 50 meters, but the record on that hill was closer to what you'd see on a 60-meter jump. And she, as an 11-year-old spunky little kid, climbed up to the top of the jump with her alpine skis and went off. And those of us who were on the jump at the time were all thinking, holy smokes. And so, as I say in that story, it was no surprise to me that years later, she became, one of the top money winners on the women's professional golf tour.
And then, not a question, but on the topic of Middlebury, John Tidd is in the audience, and he fondly remembers the Middlebury years with you and Dennis, and they influenced his life in Nordic skiing.
Oh, that's great. Well, I appreciate. He's had a tremendous influence on Nordic skiing as well, and I've got a nice course or trail around our house here in Thetford, which I groom every time we get adequate snow with an old Skidoo Scandeck and a Tidtech trail tenderizer. And we have the same setup up at Thetford Academy and groom the trails there with a comparable machine. So he's made a great contribution to the Nordic sport, an affordable way to get great cross-country skiing.
What's your best experience as a competitor?
Wow.
No pressure.
Best experience as a competitor. Yeah, that is like, I have to say, I guess one memorable one for me was, I was very grateful to get into Middlebury, and I was especially grateful to make the Middlebury ski team. I still remember one of the early team meetings when Bobo Sheehan said, look around the room, and it was filled with these very prominent alpine skiers at the time. And he said, we've alpine skiers here are a dime a dozen. If you want to make the Middlebury ski team, you better ski cross country. And I thought to myself, yes, I might have a chance. And my sophomore year, the final carnival of the season was the Middlebury Carnival. It was also the Eastern Intercollegiate Championships, and it was in a blizzard. It's just snowing like crazy. And I can remember heading out on the course thinking, well, if I can just try to hang with the guys that pass me, maybe I can do all right in this. And, I got a couple of kilometers into it and nobody passed me. And I might have had really good wax that day. I know I didn't have any pressure on me. Nobody expected me to do anything. but I ended up passing some of the skiers that had headed out ahead of me, and some of them were I knew as being really potential winners in the race, and I'm thinking, whoa, I probably started out too fast. I'm going to be in trouble. But it was one of those days, and anybody who has competed for any length of time probably has a similar experience, and it doesn't happen often. It may happen only once or twice or handful of times in a career, but you just get in the zone, and it's almost like you can't go hard enough. You don't get tired. You just cruising along. And that was one of those days for me. I just remember having, and I was more surprised than anybody else by the fact that when the results were put together, I won it. And I had no clue that I was skiing that well that day. And I'm sure it had a lot to do with, the conditions and, waxing and everything else, but it just fell into place for me. It was a wonderful experience.
All right. Jennifer Zakara, who is the head of school at Vermont Academy, she's in the audience and she has joined us for many of these red benches. Welcome back, Jennifer. Her question, how does your writer self contemplate as you compete? Are your skier and writer selves part of the experience in competing?
Yeah, excellent question. And, and maybe I'm dodging the question, but I could almost reverse it and say my skier self has really helped with the writing, because to be a Nordic skier, you definitely have to have some discipline, and there are times, if not daily, at least weekly, you definitely have to buckle down and do the work. And that that's a sport where hard work and dedication really pay off. That it's about consistency and just doing the work. And I learned that that was very helpful to me when I started writing, and knowing that, whether or not you felt like it, or whether you felt you had a good idea, or you just had to do it. You have to do the work. And then I can remember as an 8th grader, my English teacher saying, this is a good first draft, but you've got to rewrite it. And I thought, oh man, doing it once, that was enough. But I eventually learned that that's a very vital and valuable part of the process, that rarely, if ever, is the first draft going to be your best effort. And once you put it aside and then go back to it, you can almost always improve it. And so I feel like the skiing has definitely helped the writing. Now, in terms of the other way around, there certainly are sometimes activities or events that I've been involved in skiing, and I've kind of thought to myself, well, there's going to be a good story in this one, because of the weather or the conditions or results or whatever. So I'm definitely aware of that sometimes.
She's also wondering if you know VA coach Warren Shivers or current coach Alexei Sotskov. Sorry if I pronounced those wrong.
Yeah, I know them both, and in fact, there's a story in the book about Warren. He was a legendary coach and very, very highly regarded. And I know not real well, but I've encountered Alexei a couple of times.
All right.
VA has a wonderful skiing tradition for generations. It's been a center of excellent skiing, and I think Marty Hall, for example, is was one of the foremost U.S. coaches, and then went to Canada and brought the Canadian team to a high level of success. And he's a VA graduate. I mean, there are a number of them that have. I think Mike Gallagher was a VA graduate. It was one of our top Nordic skiers in the early days. So wonderful tradition there.
All right. Reese Brown, assuming you were at the Yugoslavia Olympics, I've heard many stories from those Olympics and interested in your experience there.
So Reese, that's one Olympics I missed, and the reason for it was that I was really pushing my luck, leaving Dartmouth in the middle of the ski season to go to Lake Placid, and I figured that I would be pushing my luck too much in '84. Although there were a number of Dartmouth skiers that were on that team. And one of the stories that I heard from that, we used to, riding in the van to and from ski races, we used to have this arrangement where the athletes would get to pick, this was back in the days of cassette tapes, the athletes would get to pick a tape, and then I'd get to pick a tape. And if we were really sort of feisty with each other, they would pick something like Def Leppard, or I don't know, I can't remember the other ones, but certainly not music that I was familiar with. And I would then pick something like John Denver. And they would just complain and, oh, John Denver. Well, John Denver had been hired by ABC to write and perform sort of an anthem for the Sarajevo Games. And he was over there. And one of the Dartmouth athletes who was the most critical of my music selection in the van told the story after he came back that one night during the Olympics, the word went out to the US team that John Denver had reserved this restaurant, the entire restaurant, and it was inviting the US athletes to come as his guest to this restaurant. And the ones that were available or wanted to went, and this one Dartmouth athlete was among them. And he said, first of all, they had this wonderful meal, and then while they were finishing the meal, he just pulled out his guitar and started singing to them. And he took requests, and he just sang to the athletes, and it certainly changed that athlete's impression of John Denver.
Ironically, this is the second time this week on a Zoom that I've gotten to say I am a big John Denver fan. Peter Graves, comment and a question. Thanks, I'm enjoying this and marvel at your storytelling abilities. Did you play a role in working closely with Josh in '88? Expectations were so high. I seem to recall a picture of you counseling him. It was a powerful picture.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Yeah, and I have there's a lot to the story of Josh in '88. First of all, he the year before in '87, the Biathlon World Championships were in Lake Placid, and Josh won a silver medal there in the 20-kilometer event, which was it was not totally unexpected, but it was a wonderful achievement. And as you could probably anticipate, in 1987 in Lake Placid, there was nobody there. There was one, I think, journalist representing Sports Illustrated, and that was it, nobody else. So she got a good article out of it. And then after the fact, Josh became one of these athletes to watch in Calgary in '88. And as we were, we got to Calgary, I think, or Canmore, which is a little bit west of Calgary, where the Nordic events were held. We got there maybe a week early, and there had been some talk. Some of the other athletes and teams had been talking about training somewhere else and then arriving in Canmore at the last minute to try to avoid all of the hype and Olympic craziness. And that discussion went on between the coaches and the athletes, and Josh was primarily the one we were thinking about, because he had the best chance to win a medal, to be honest about it. And I can remember debating about that, and you know, probably I may have made the wrong decision, but we ended up going back and forth. Nobody was really firmly saying, yeah, we got to leave here. We got to pack up and go to West Yellowstone or go someplace where we're not in this sort of fishbowl, and then just come back before the 20K and race. And we wrestled with it back and forth. And ultimately, my view was it was going to be more of a hassle to try to pack everything up and find transportation and all of the bureaucracy involved with probably crossing the border with the rifles and back and so forth. And ultimately, I elected to we'll just stay and try to keep a low profile. And then what happened was that one after another of the America's hopefuls had trouble, and some of the alpine skiers that were expected to do well ended up having trouble. And so as it got close, the biathlon events were the second week, and as the biathlon events got closer, we started seeing headlines like Josh Thompson, America's last hope for gold. And I'm thinking, oh no, you know, talk about putting pressure on the guy. And he had definitely wanted to get out of there, to go to West Yellowstone or someplace just to avoid the pressure. So as the race came around, the other thing that figured into it was the weather was warming, and it was pretty evident that with the schedule of the race that things were going to be softening up during the course of the race. And there were some of us that were saying, shouldn't we, typically the stronger athletes go toward the end of the starting order, at least in biathlon and cross country. But some of us were saying, you know, because it's going to warm up, why don't we put him out in the first seed? And there's a danger then that he draws number one, which is not a good position to go in. But, you know, if he were somewhere in the top 10 and then things softened up for the later skiers, it could be a real advantage. But he wanted to be with the other hotshots, which it makes sense in a way, because then he knows how he's doing relative to the other medal contenders. And he did terrific through the first three stages, and he was in, I don't know, probably fourth or fifth place coming into the last standing stage of shooting. And, you know, he'd done his best. He was in the hunt. He was right there, and he missed two targets. And he went from, like, I think fourth to 21st or something like that, just by that. And those two misses could have been, you know, less than the width of a bullet. And I can remember after the fact seeing some TV coverage and ABC, who they'd put all this, you know, pressure on, oh, Josh Thompson, America's best hope for gold and all the rest. When he missed those two shots, the commentator said, well, that's it for Thompson. Let's go back to hockey. And and he was crushed. I mean, he knew he had it. He knew he had the possibility. And, you know, when he came through the finish line, he was just crushed. As anybody who has a real legitimate chance to medal and put so much into it, I mean, you don't do it halfway. You know, he was fully committed and knew that it was possible. So, you know, coming in 21st or whatever it was terribly disappointing for him. I would have been thrilled if I'd ever finished 21st.
Another question from Peter. Can you talk a bit about the remarkable Alexander Tikhonov of the Soviet Union? He really befriended many American athletes, and I believe you included. Was he taking a risk by being friendly with American athletes? Yeah,
another great question, Peter. So Tikhonov is a very, very interesting character. And right from the start, he was different than all the other Soviets. He was very confident. He was very gregarious. A lot of the other Soviets, even their best athletes, their medal winners, were very reluctant to engage with Americans. But Tikhonov was this. There was just a certain bravado about him, and we became friends. And in Lake Placid in 1980, I went to he was at the World Championships. I'm sorry, not 1980. It was 80. Let me think. Yeah, I got to get this right now. No, it was 73, the Biathlon World Championships. First time we had hosted them in the United States, and he had done well with the Soviet team. He was packing up, and in the hotel they were staying, and I went just to see him off and say goodbye. And he didn't speak much English, and I didn't speak any Russian, so it was just a lot of hand signals and a little bit of German here and there. He says, "John, klein problem," and he opens this big gigantic suitcase he's got there, and he says, "Space, I have space, no dollars, no dollars." So what he ends up explaining to me is he's still got room in his suitcase, but he doesn't have any money to buy any more blue jeans or long play record albums or things that he could sell for 4 or 5 or 6 times the price back in the Soviet Union. So I pulled out my wallet, and I didn't have much cash, but I just gave him all the cash I had. And he saw that. He saw that and he looks at it, and he says, no. And he gives me a $10 bill back. So at least they have $10. And he said, "John, next year, Minsk, USA team, no problem, no problem." And sure enough, the next year when we arrived in Minsk, he meets the airplane. We all get off the plane. It was a chartered flight with the Norwegians and Brits and I don't know, maybe the Swedes. But he corrals the Americans, and he brings me with him in his private car, and we go to this special tourist shop, which I think only at that time Soviet VIPs could visit. And we go in, and he's, "John, how many American team? How many? And I think at the time we might have had 12 altogether, including juniors and coaches. Yep, 12, Alexander, 12. So he goes around, and there are these little carved boxes. He says, "John, it's good, хорошо." I said, "Oh yeah, those look very nice." He goes to the lady, 12 of these. And then he goes over, and there's the nesting dolls. "Good." I said, "Yeah, nice. 12 of those." He goes around the shop, and he's getting 12 of like everything that's in the shop. These beautiful colored shawls and enameled plates. And we go back to the hotel, and he hands out all this stuff to the whole U.S. team. Probably a dozen Soviet craft items to each one of the American athletes and coaches. So, and he was a powerful figure in the Soviet sports world. There's a lot more to the story too, but that's probably another story.
All right. As I try to keep up with these questions, we might I'm trying to not bounce around so much, but we might start bouncing around in topics a little bit. In the audience, anonymous, so I don't know who they are, but their family read your book, Medal of Honor, and are wondering if you are still planning on writing a sequel.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was encouraging to me to get this Celebrate Winter out. I had discouraging luck with publishing the previous books, and it became a real chore, and it wasn't something that I really enjoyed. And to be honest, at the same time, the trail design work, kind of took off and kept me really busy. But I enjoy the storytelling, and I do have what I think is a reasonable idea for a sequel. So this getting this one out has been encouraging. So no guarantees, but possibly.
Great. All right, back to biathlon. Which is the more important skill, skiing or shooting?
That's the beauty of biathlon, is they're both equally important, and they work hard to balance the two of them. And at some time ago, it appeared to some of the decision makers internationally that the athletes were getting really capable with the shooting, so that rather than just the first few athletes shooting clean, or in other words, hitting all their targets, there were more than that. And so one of the things that they've done, they figured out, well, we've got to make the shooting a little bit more difficult, so it retains that balance in the sport. So back in the old days, we almost always had some sort of a gradual descent, or at least a flat approach to the shooting range, where you could kind of collect yourself and kind of mentally say, okay, now I'm switching from a skier to a shooter. But more recently, a lot of the big international race courses, venues, are including a gradual climb up into the shooting range. And some of them, like Albertville in '92, it was a significant climb. So the athletes are coming in with a higher pulse, and it makes the shooting more challenging. But they work hard to really maintain that balance. And there's a third component there that's often overlooked. But you not only have to shoot accurately and ski fast, but you have to shoot fast, because you could come in, take your time shooting, but if you're 10 seconds slower than most everybody else, and the race involves 4 shooting stops, you're 40 seconds out, and you're never gonna win a race like that. You've got to be able to hit all the targets, but you've got to hit them fast now.
Well, that segues pretty perfectly into this question. Can you speak to the training and athletic ability to control breathing and heartbeat after racing to a shooting site and then having to start shooting immediately?
Yes, and that's sort of the essence of what makes biathlon such a challenging sport, is this conversion. We used to facetiously refer to going from being a rabbit to a rock, and that's not totally unrealistic comparison, in that and in the old days, I'm not sure they still do it on today's courses, but in the old days they used to have a marker 100 meters prior to the shooting range. So one of the reasons was the athletes would see that marker and say, okay, I've got 100 meters to kind of get my respiration and pulse under control before I have to settle down and shoot. And I think that that's one of the. I've also heard it said there are a number of different shooting events or sports, right? And one of them is running deer or running boar, where the targets move, and unlike, say, position shooting, where they're shooting at bullseyes, at targets. And I've heard it said that biathlon is more like running boar or running deer, because the rifle is never completely steady. The athletes learn to shoot through their respiration, and you can sometimes see on these close-ups on the TV that the rifles are actually moving, but they have learned how to control their trigger pull so that it's in a predictable movement, or almost like a rotation.
All right.
I don't know if I answered that accurately or not.
There are several new biathlon ranges at cross-country ski areas now. What are your thoughts on how these new ranges are helping to grow the sport?
Yeah, I think it's terrific, and I'm very impressed with like the new range that was recently constructed up at Craftsbury. That's a wonderful facility, and in the old days, biathlon, because of the 150-meter range and the loud report of the big bore rifles, the ranges were not usually located in any sort of approximate place to the rest of the sports facilities. Biathlon was always off in some other town or some other valley. But now with the 22 caliber rifles and the shorter range, it can often be tucked in and be part of a Nordic venue, and it oftentimes is. I was astounded. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were able to go to Oslo for the Biathlon World Championships, and they had just created this new biathlon facility it's part of the Holmenkollen facility where the big iconic ski jump is. And in fact, the biathlon range is right at the base of the ski jump. And they had the athletes actually going around behind the targets, but they have these big glass panels to protect them, but it's all created for spectator interest. And it's, as you can imagine, in a place like Oslo, there, 50, 60, 70,000 people watching and cheering, and they've made it a remarkably exciting spectator event.
Did racers ski penalty loops when you were competing?
Yeah, and some racers skied a lot of them. We talked about getting dizzy on the penalty loop, but yeah, in the individual event, as I mentioned, we shot on paper, and you didn't really know for sure how you, because they had to score the targets. They took the targets down off the target boards, and they scored them very carefully after the race, and you got assigned penalty minutes based on your misses, and a close miss would give you 1 minute penalty, but a miss that was farther out another scoring ring would give you 2 minutes penalty. So you could definitely build up the penalties pretty quickly. But then in the relay event, we skied penalty loops, and the relay's a little bit different in that they give you 3 extra rounds to hit the 5 targets. So it generates more excitement because you can take a little bit of a risk, and and if you have good luck, you may hit 5 for 5 and be out of there. If you miss one, you've got these 3 extra rounds. You have to load them individually, and it takes a little more time to do it, but it makes it exciting because the athletes will definitely take a risk.
Okay. Are there any other developments that you've seen in the Nordic field in general throughout your career?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the equipment has gone through a lot of transformations. We back in the old days, we skied on wooden skis. We broke a lot of them. The introduction of fiberglass skis was a big advancement. They were faster and they were more durable. The grooming of the trails has been a big asset. I think the thing I notice the most now, just as a fan and a spectator, is how much more widely known the sport is and recognized. And it's as I mentioned, extremely popular in Europe, and it's gaining popularity here in the States. I mean, there are a number of, I mentioned earlier that back when we were skiing, it was often considered that if you couldn't make the cross-country team, well, maybe biathlon was an option. You could try to learn to shoot and make the biathlon team. Well, there are an awful lot of young athletes now that their mission is to make the biathlon team. And they, right from the start, that's what they want to do. And many of them are fast enough so that they could easily make the cross-country team, but biathlon's their first choice.
All right. Another question from Dennis. Can you speak to equality in biathlon between men and women?
Yeah, I think that it was a long time coming to involve women in the sport. But to my perspective now, what you see on television coverage from Europe is that the women are at least as popular, and perhaps in some instances more popular, that the European fans and spectators are very, very excited about the top female athletes. That time I mentioned that my wife and I were able to go to Oslo for the World Championships. I mean, we were obviously excited to see the American athletes, but what was surprising to me was that when Susan Dunkley came in to the arena to shoot, we were surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of Norwegian fans, and we had our start list and everything, and we're watching, bib numbers, and all of a sudden, all these fans around us start chanting, "Susan Dunkley, Susan Dunkley, Susan Dunkley." It was terrific. It was great, and they were very, very excited that this American woman was challenging the best biathletes in Europe, and they loved that. They were excited about that. So I think certainly there's probably more parity in biathlon there is in many other sports, that the women are extremely popular.
All right, a question from Bob Burnham about your time in Alaska. Are there any really, really memorable adventures that you can share where you were skiing out into the wilderness back in the days before all this new gear that we have?
Wow. Well, I can describe one. There was a place in Anchorage called Russian Jack Springs, and they used to have night races there, and the lighting was somewhat primitive, but it was because it got dark at like 3 in the afternoon in December. They had some what we'd describe perhaps as street lights, and you'd go from one sort of bright cone of light through the dark to the next one, and so forth. And we lived and trained out at Fort Richardson, which was a few miles outside of Anchorage. But in the wintertime, early in the season, we'd go down to Russian Jack Springs for these, I don't know what they were, Tuesday night races or Wednesday night races or something. And I can remember one particular, I can't say that this was the same race, but it was the same site. It was at Russian Jack Springs. One of the events, we heard, I can remember skiing past one of my teammates who was having trouble with his binding. And, in those days, the bindings and boots were very pathetic compared to the equipment of today. And you had these leather-soled boots, and if they got wet and soggy, the bindings wouldn't really hold them properly. And this guy was having a terrible time keeping his ski on. He'd put the binding on and take a few strides, and his ski would come off. And the next thing we knew, he was walking back after the race was over. He walked back out of the woods with this broken ski. And then later it was revealed that one of the other athletes saw him. He got so frustrated that he just took the ski like a baseball bat and swung it at a birch tree and broke it because he was so frustrated with the binding. And that got a lot of laughs at the team meeting the next day. And another event that happened at the same Russian Jack Springs was there were frequently moose around, and they never caused much of a problem, but you did have to pay attention to them. And you definitely didn't want to get between a cow and a calf. And you usually shout and they would trot out of the way. But there was this one particular young, usually it was the, young adolescent moose, usually the bulls, that would cause the problems. And I can remember skiing past, again, another one of our teammates, and he had climbed a birch tree with both his ski poles and his skis still on, and this young bull moose was at the base of the birch tree. I don't know how actively he wasn't attacking him, but he was at the base of the birch tree and had to be scared off so our teammate could get down out of the tree. He will remain unnamed.
All right. There's quite a few questions in here about your trail designing business, and I want to make sure we touch upon that, and I want to be cognizant of the time.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions before we get to trail design. What do you see as the future of Olympic biathlon venues, considering the high cost of hosting Olympic events? Do you think there's enough international oversight of doping control?
Yeah, okay, so a couple of questions there. I think that almost all of the big international sites now have snowmaking. It's just part of the world we live in now. And it may be that there will be fewer and fewer World Cup sites and potential Olympic or World Championship sites, but I think it will continue to be popular because it's so popular on European TV now. I think doping is unfortunately it's a big issue, and I think that there are those in the international WADA, like the International Anti-Doping Organization, that are trying hard to stay ahead of the unethical athletes and coaches and team physicians. And in the case of Russia, the country, they had, it's pretty well established now that they had a kind of a national program during the Sochi Olympics. It's a problem, and it's probably not going to go away. It's a question of trying to stay at least up with, or ideally ahead of, the unethical people who just feel motivated to break the rules. And it seems to vacillate. There are times when particular sports or particular nations seem to be really doing a good job and being very conscientious about it. And you can kind of say, well, I think this nation is clean and these athletes don't use any kind of performance enhancing, illegal performance enhancement. And then other times there's something happens and it all goes out the window. But it's probably just going to be a constant battle.
All right. Is the military, Army, or Guard still a big part of support for biathlon? If not, where does the support come from?
So I think, yeah, the National Guard is still a big supporter of biathlon, and there are National Guard units all across the nation, from Alaska to Maine, that have biathlon teams. They compete in the Guard Championships every year, but perhaps even more importantly, they provide an experienced cadre of biathlon enthusiasts that know how to host events and know how to safely operate shooting ranges. And so the Guard, I think, plays a vital role. Having said that, the USBA, the U.S. Biathlon Association, has done a remarkable job in recent years generating more sponsorship dollars and doing a much better job of funding the team. And I think our athletes today can compete at World Cups and World Championships with the confidence that they are as well coached and as well supported as any of the teams that they face.
Okay, great. I want to touch upon some of these questions regarding your the trails you build and design. Where are some of the trails that you've designed?
Boy, they're all over the place. Most of them, of course, are in this country. A lot in here in the Northeast, but I've done a nice competition venue at Casper Mountain in Wyoming, near Casper, Wyoming. Let's see. I've in the last few years, I've had two very interesting projects in China. One that's been completed, one that sort of is on hold because of the pandemic and sort of, I guess you'd say, international politics. But I learned just a couple of days ago that may kick back into gear. So there, yeah, and by and large, I do a lot of projects for private landowners who just want a nice, comfortable way to get out and enjoy their property. I do some for schools and municipalities, organizations, and then some for venues or organizations that aspire to host major events like national championships or even in the case, I did a couple of projects a number of years ago up in northern Maine that have hosted biathlon World Cups and World Junior Championships.
So when you go to a new site, how do you approach laying out a set of trails? What are the factors or features you're looking for?
Yeah, well, if it's a course that's going to be, as they say, homologated to international standards, in other words, meet all of the criteria both for cross country and biathlon, there's some fairly specific standards that you have to meet. And the ones that are the most challenging to keep in mind as you're configuring the course are the having to do with the climbs, because there are requirements for different types of climbs, where they come in the courses, how high they can be, and so those standards are the ones that you look for in the terrain that's available. You look for where you can find those climbs, and then how you get to them within the constraint of the length of the loop. And the most popular loop for cross country and biathlon these days are something like in the neighborhood of 1.5 kilometers is a popular length, 2.5 kilometers, and then maybe 5 kilometers. They're going to much shorter loops than they used to in the old days, primarily because of television. They don't want to put out 25 cameras all over the countryside. They'd rather have 4 or 5 on a short loop.
All right. Well, there are definitely still questions we're not going to be able to get to. We've kept John here talking for a long time, but he's full of knowledge and a lot of great stories. So thank you so much, John. Really appreciate you joining us here tonight. I hope that, these stories have inspired all of you in the audience to pick up John's book. Don't forget, it is in our shop. And thank you for another evening around the Red Bench. We have one more of these events left for the season on April 22nd. And we would be doing a one-on-one conversation with World Cup alpine ski racer Phil Mayer. And again, please consider making a donation. Donations of any amount have a big impact, and we're super grateful for your support. The event was recorded, so if you want to watch this again or share it with friends and family, it will be on our YouTube channel next week. And thank you again. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks very much, Abby. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Good night.
Night.